Some of the most celebrated engineering innovations from luxury car history, features that cost manufacturers and buyers an absolute fortune to develop and install, worked exactly 0% of the time when they were actually needed. Not because they were poorly made, not because the engineers were incompetent, but because the fundamental premise behind each one was flawed from the start. And when I get to number 14, you are going to want to write down the exact mechanism of failure, because it is genuinely shocking that this made it into production vehicles at all. These were not budget shortcuts. These were premium features that luxury brands charged thousands of dollars extra for. Features that appeared in brochures that salespeople pitched as cutting-edge technology that buyers genuinely believed would make them safer or more comfortable or more in control. And every single one of them failed spectacularly when put to the test. Some failed quietly. Some failed in ways that made the problem worse than having nothing at all. And a few of them, you will completely understand why they disappeared without anyone mourning their loss. Subscribe now, because what follows is the most expensive automotive failure parade you have never heard the full story about. Night vision systems with thermal imaging. This was the absolute pinnacle of luxury car technology in the early 2000s. Cadillac, BMW, Mercedes-Benz. These systems used infrared cameras to detect heat signatures ahead of the vehicle and project a green-tinted heads-up display onto the windshield or a dashboard screen. The pitch was simple. See pedestrians and animals in total darkness before your headlights could reach them. React faster. Drive safer. The systems cost between $3,000 and $6,000 as an option. Here is what actually happened. Drivers could not process the information fast enough. The thermal image showed everything that was warm, which in an urban environment meant every person, every running car, every steam vent, every hot dog cart, every air conditioning unit. Your brain had to scan this chaotic heat map, identify which blob was a threat, determine its distance and trajectory, and react appropriately, all while also watching the actual road through the windshield. Cognitive load studies showed drivers using these systems had slower reaction times than drivers using standard headlights alone, because they were trying to process two completely different visual feeds simultaneously. Insurance data showed no reduction in nighttime pedestrian strikes for vehicles equipped with these systems. None. Mercedes-Benz quietly stopped offering it after 2 generations. BMW dropped it entirely. Cadillac kept trying for a few more years before admitting defeat. The technology worked perfectly. The human brain just was not wired to use it while driving at 60 miles per hour. $6,000 for a system that made you slower to react. Still available on some vehicles, but almost nobody buys it anymore, and the manufacturers will not tell you why. Early adaptive cruise control with stop-and-go functionality. This was supposed to be the future. Your car would maintain distance from the vehicle ahead, slow down automatically, even come to a complete stop in traffic, then resume when traffic moved. Luxury brands charged between $2,000 and $4,000 for this between 2005 and 2012. The system used radar sensors to track the car ahead. Here is the catastrophic flaw. If the car ahead changed lanes suddenly, revealing a stopped vehicle directly in your path, the system would not react in time. The radar was tracking the moving car, lost the signal when that car moved, then had to reacquire a completely different target that was stationary and much closer. That process took between 1 and 2 seconds. At highway speeds, you just traveled over 100 feet with no braking. The system would eventually slam the brakes, but often too late or with insufficient force. The owner's manual for these early systems included a disclaimer that the driver must remain alert and ready to brake manually at all times, which completely defeated the purpose of the system. Multiple class action lawsuits. Dozens of rear-end collisions where drivers trusted the technology and it failed to detect the stopped vehicle until impact was unavoidable. Modern systems use camera fusion and predictive algorithms that have mostly solved this, but those early adaptive cruise systems were objectively worse than just using your own right foot. Premium feature, premium price, 0% reliability when it actually mattered. Electrochromatic self-dimming side mirrors with auto tilt on reverse. Luxury sedans from Lexus, Audi and Mercedes in the late 90s through early 2000s offered side mirrors that would automatically dim when headlights behind you were detected, and tilt downward when you shifted into reverse to help you see the curb. Cost around $1,200 as part of a memory seat package. Sounds brilliant until you understand the failure mode. The dimming feature used photo sensors that detected bright light and triggered an electric current to darken the mirror glass. In cold weather below about 30 degrees Fahrenheit, the electrochromatic gel inside the mirror would slow down dramatically. The mirror would take 15 to 20 seconds to dim, by which point the car behind you had already passed or you had been blinded. Worse, once dimmed, it would take even longer to return to normal brightness, sometimes staying dark for over a minute after the light source was gone. You would merge lanes and suddenly have a nearly black side mirror showing you nothing. The auto tilt feature had its own problem. If you parallel parked on a steep hill and shifted to reverse, the mirror would tilt based on level ground assumptions, pointing uselessly at the sky or the pavement instead of the curb. The tilt motors also failed frequently, leaving mirrors stuck in the downward position permanently until you paid another $400 to replace the motor assembly. Lexus issued a technical service bulletin about this. Audi extended warranties specifically for these mirror motors. Mercedes simply removed the feature from later models without announcing it. You paid over $1,000 for mirrors that worked worse than the manual flip tab your parents had. Automatic parking systems that required more input than just parking manually. These started appearing around 2006. Lincoln, Lexus, BMW. The car would theoretically steer itself into a parallel parking space while you controlled the accelerator and brake. The system used ultrasonic sensors to measure the space, calculate the geometry, and execute the maneuver. Cost between $800 and $1,500 depending on the brand. Here is why it was functionally useless. First, the space had to be at least 6 feet longer than your vehicle. Most parallel parking in actual cities involves spaces that are barely 2 feet longer than your car, which is the entire reason parallel parking is difficult. The system would reject these spaces as too small. Second, you had to position your car exactly parallel to the parking space at a precise distance, usually between 2 and 3 feet from the parked cars before activating the system. If you were too close or too far or at an angle, the system would abort. Third, you still had to modulate the accelerator and brake perfectly while the car steered. Too much throttle and the system would shut off. Too much brake and it would abort. You were doing 70% of the work while the car handled only the steering, which is the easy part of parallel parking anyway. And fourth, the system was so slow that in any real urban environment, cars behind you would start honking within seconds, causing most drivers to panic and just park manually anyway. YouTube is filled with videos of these systems failing or taking 45 seconds to park where a human would take 12. The technology has improved dramatically in recent years, but those early systems were objectively worse than having a basic understanding of how your car's dimensions worked. Premium price for a feature that made parking more stressful, not less. If you are the kind of person who has ever wondered why certain expensive technologies just vanish from car options lists without explanation, I have put together a complete timeline of luxury car features that failed in production, organized by year and manufacturer, with the specific reasons each one was quietly discontinued. It includes internal technical service bulletins, class action lawsuit summaries, and the actual failure rates manufacturers never published. Grab it at the link in the description. Voice-activated navigation systems before natural language processing. From the late 90s through the early 2010s, luxury cars offered voice-controlled navigation. Acura, Infiniti, Mercedes, BMW. Instead of typing in an address, you would speak it and the system would input it for you. These systems cost between $1,500 and $3,000 as part of navigation packages. They failed spectacularly because they required you to speak in rigid command structures that nobody could remember. You could not say, "Take me to 5th Avenue and 23rd Street. You had to say navigation, destination, street, 5th Avenue, number 2, 3, enter. If you missed a step or paused too long, the system would time out and you had to start over. If you said or coughed, it would interpret that as a command and take you somewhere random. If you had any accent at all, even regional American accents, the recognition rate dropped below 50%. BMW's system famously could not understand the word zero in most American accents, interpreting it as hero or Nero, making it nearly impossible to input any address with a zero in it. Owners would spend 5 minutes trying to voice input an address fail, then just type it manually on the screen anyway. Consumer Reports tested these systems in 2009 and found that manual input was faster in 100% of test cases. 100%. The voice activation added time and frustration without ever succeeding at its only job. Modern systems using actual AI language models work reasonably well. These early systems were voice recognition from the 80s trying to pretend they were voice understanding from the future. They were not. $1,500 to talk to a system that could not understand you. Hydraulic active suspension that could raise and lower individual corners. This was the ultimate luxury feature. Mercedes, Lexus, Audi. The car would use hydraulic actuators to raise or lower each wheel independently, keeping the body level during cornering, smoothing out bumps in real time, even raising the car for ground clearance or lowering it for aerodynamics. Cost between $3,000 and $7,000 depending on implementation. The systems worked beautifully for about 40,000 miles. Then the hydraulic lines started leaking. Every single one. The fluid was under enormous pressure, cycling constantly, and the seals would fail. Once one corner started leaking, the system would struggle to maintain pressure, causing the other corners to work harder, which accelerated their seal failures. Within 6 months of the first leak, you would have a car that sagged unevenly, made groaning noises every time you turned, and threw dashboard warning lights constantly. The repair cost was staggering. You could not just replace one actuator. The system required all four corners to be rebuilt simultaneously to maintain calibration. Parts and labor ran between $5,000 and $9,000, more than the original option cost. Mercedes extended warranties on these systems 3 separate times because of failure rates. Lexus bought back vehicles under lemon laws. Audi quietly discontinued the feature after 1 generation. Owners of these cars faced a choice: pay nearly $10,000 to repair a luxury feature, or disable the system entirely and convert to conventional springs and shocks for about $3,000. Most chose conversion. You paid $7,000 for a system that worked for 3 years and then cost more to fix than it cost to install. The most expensive temporary feature in automotive history. Infrared keyless entry systems that only worked in perfect conditions. Before modern RF key fobs, luxury cars in the 90s used infrared remote entry. Cadillac Lincoln Infiniti. You pointed a remote at the car and pressed unlock just like a TV remote. Cost between $400 and $800, which was significant in 1995 money. Here is why it was worse than a physical key. Infrared requires line of sight. If anything was between the remote and the sensor on the car, it would not work. A person walking by a shopping cart, a light pole, anything. Rain would scatter the infrared signal. Bright sunlight would overwhelm the sensor. If your car was parked facing away from you, the sensor was on the driver's door, so you had to walk around to that side for it to work. If the remote battery was even slightly low, the range dropped from 30 feet to about 6 feet, at which point you might as well just use the key. Owners kept these remotes on their keychains, where they would get scratched and dirty, further reducing effectiveness. Within 2 years, most of these remotes had success rates below 50%. You would stand in a parking lot pointing your remote at your car, pressing the button over and over, looking like you were trying to use the force. Then you would give up and unlock it with the key that was on the same keychain the whole time. RF systems replaced these almost immediately because radio waves do not care about line of sight or weather. But for about 5 years, luxury car owners paid a premium for remote entry that worked less reliably than the mechanical key they already had. Automated manual gearboxes that combined the worst aspects of both transmission types. Ferrari, Maserati, Lamborghini, and BMW all offered these in the early 2000s. A traditional manual transmission, but instead of a clutch pedal and shifter, the car controlled the clutch and shifts electronically. You got paddle shifters or an automatic mode. These cost between $3,000 and $8,000 extra over the manual transmission. They were engineering disasters. In automatic mode, the computer had to guess when you wanted to shift based on throttle position and speed. It guessed wrong constantly. You would accelerate gently and the car would hold second gear until 4,000 RPM before slamming into third with a jolt that snapped your head forward. Or you would try to accelerate quickly and it would upshift too early, killing all momentum. The shifts were slow, often taking a full second to complete, during which power was completely cut. That 1 second gap made these cars slower than traditional automatics despite being marketed as performance features. In manual mode using the paddles, you still had the slow shift times, plus the computer would override your commands if it thought you were going to stall or overrev, often at the exact moment you needed the power. Ferrari's F1 transmission in the 360 was notorious for this. Drivers would attempt to downshift for a corner, and the computer would refuse, forcing them to take the corner in the wrong gear. The clutches wore out in a third of the time a traditional manual clutch would last because the computer could not modulate engagement smoothly. Replacement clutches cost between $3,000 and $6,000. BMW discontinued their SMG transmission after 1 generation. Ferrari switched to dual clutch designs. Maserati stopped offering it entirely. These transmissions were slower than automatics, more expensive than manuals, less reliable than both, and worse to drive than either. A premium feature that had zero advantages over the transmissions it was supposed to replace. Cornering headlights that turned with the steering wheel mechanically. Not modern adaptive LED systems, but the original mechanical versions from the late 90s and early 2000s. Your headlight assemblies would physically rotate up to 15 degrees as you turned the steering wheel, illuminating the corner. Acura, Mazda, Volvo, and several European brands offered these. Cost between $800 and $2,000. The mechanism was simple. A servo motor connected to the steering angle sensor would rotate the entire headlight housing. Here is what nobody told you. Those servo motors were not sealed units. Road salt, water, and dirt would get into the mechanism within 2 winters. The motors would seize, leaving your headlights stuck pointing 15 degrees to the left or right. You would be driving straight and your headlights would be aimed at the shoulder. Or the motors would develop play in the gears, causing the headlights to wobble and shake constantly as you drove, creating a strobe effect that made it harder to see, and caused oncoming drivers to flash their high beams at you thinking your lights were misaligned. The motors could not be serviced. You had to replace the entire headlight assembly, which cost between $600 and $1,200 per side, because the motor was integrated into the housing. Mazda extended warranties on these specifically. Volvo issued multiple service bulletins. Modern systems use LED arrays that selectively illuminate different segments without moving parts, but those mechanical systems lasted an average of 5 years before failing. And the repair cost more than the original option. You paid $2,000 for headlights that would eventually cost $2,400 to fix. Automatic high beam systems that blinded oncoming traffic. These appeared around 2008. The car would automatically switch between high and low beams based on detecting headlights or taillights ahead of you. Premium feature on luxury cars cost between $300 and $600. Sounds perfect. Worked terribly. The camera system that detected other lights was mounted behind the rearview mirror, looking through your windshield. If your windshield had any dirt, rain, or snow on it, the camera's effectiveness dropped to nearly zero. The system would fail to detect oncoming cars and leave your high beams on, blinding them. Or it would detect their headlights too late, leaving your brights on until they were close enough that you had already blinded them for several seconds. Worse, the system would detect streetlights, lit signs, and even reflective road markers as vehicles, causing your high beams to flip off and on constantly in urban and suburban areas. The flickering was more distracting than just leaving them off. And on divided highways with a median barrier, the system would sometimes detect cars in the opposite lanes and turn your high beams off even though those cars could not see your lights anyway. You would be driving on an empty highway with your low beams on for no reason. The sensitivity could not be adjusted on most systems. Owners would either disable the feature entirely or just ignore it and control the high beams manually. Modern systems use much better cameras and smarter algorithms, but those early systems made you the person everyone else on the road hated. Premium feature that turned you into a menace. Electronic brake force distribution that pulsed incorrectly on loose surfaces. This was pitched as advanced ABS. Instead of just preventing wheel lockup, the system would actively distribute braking force to individual wheels based on weight transfer and traction. High-end Mercedes, BMW, and Audi models in the early 2000s, included as part of stability control packages costing between $1,200 and $2,000. On dry pavement, it worked fine. On gravel, dirt, or snow, it would pulse the brakes in a pattern that actually increased stopping distances. The system was calibrated for pavement. When it detected wheel slip on a loose surface, it would reduce brake pressure to that wheel to prevent lockup, which is correct. But then it would immediately reapply pressure to test for traction, detect slip again, reduce pressure again in a rapid cycle. This cycling meant your brakes were only partially applied most of the time. Your stopping distance on gravel could be 30% longer with the system active than with traditional ABS or no ABS at all. Drivers would feel the brake pedal pulsing rapidly and assume the system was working, not realizing they were actually taking longer to stop. Multiple winter climate driving schools documented this. Some Mercedes models allowed you to fully disable stability control, which also disabled this brake distribution, and instructors would tell students to turn it off entirely when driving on anything other than pavement. A system that was supposed to improve braking made it objectively worse in the conditions where you needed it most. No recall, no fix, just a quiet revision in later model years that nobody announced. Memory seats with 20-way adjustment that never returned to the same position. Luxury cars have had memory seats since the 80s, but the ultra-premium versions with 16, 18, or 20-way adjustments appeared in the late 90s. Lumbar, side bolster, thigh support, headrest angle, everything motorized and programmable. Cost between $1,500 and $3,000 depending on how many motors were involved. The problem was mechanical tolerance. With 6 or 8 adjustment motors all moving independently, each motor had a small amount of play in its gears, maybe 2 millimeters, across 8 motors that added up to a total variation of over an inch in final position. You would program your seat position, drive for a week, then press the memory button and the seat would come back to something close but noticeably different. Your lumbar would be slightly higher, your thigh support slightly forward, nothing felt quite right, you would reprogram it. A month later, same problem. The motors also did not move at consistent speeds. Whichever motor finished first would stop while the others kept moving, and the stopping position was never exactly the same. The more adjustments the seat had, the worse this problem became. Some owners would press the memory button 2 or 3 times in a row, and each time the seat would move slightly, hunting for a position it could never quite find. 20-way adjustable seats were objectively worse at returning to your position than 4-way manual seats, which had no motors to develop play. You paid $3,000 for seats that could never remember where they were supposed to be. Rain-sensing wipers that could not tell rain from anything else. These used optical sensors on the windshield to detect water droplets and automatically adjust wiper speed. Appeared on luxury cars in the late 90s, cost between $200 and $400. Brilliant concept, terrible execution. The sensors could not distinguish between rain, road spray, bugs, or dirt. A truck would pass you on the highway and kick up mist, and your wipers would go into high-speed mode for 10 seconds. A bug would hit the windshield and your wipers would do one aggressive swipe, smearing it across your entire field of vision instead of letting you spray washer fluid first. Light drizzle would be ignored, but the moment it picked up slightly, the wipers would jump to maximum speed, far faster than necessary. You could not predict what the system would do, which made driving more distracting because you were constantly monitoring whether the wipers were doing the right thing. The sensitivity adjustment was usually a tiny dial hidden somewhere, and even at the lowest sensitivity the system was overeager. Most drivers would just switch to manual mode and never use the automatic function. Modern systems are significantly better, but for about 15 years, rain-sensing wipers were a premium feature that nobody trusted. $400 to have less control over your own wipers. Night vision pedestrian detection with warning chimes that cried wolf constantly. This was different from the thermal imaging system mentioned earlier. This version, offered by GM and Mercedes around 2005, would actively alert you with a chime and a dashboard icon when it detected a pedestrian in your path. Cost between $2,000 and $3,000. The problem was false positives. The system would alert for mailboxes, road signs, reflective posts, shopping carts, anything vaguely person-shaped and warmer than the surrounding air. Driving through a suburban neighborhood at night, you would get 15 false alerts per mile. The chime was loud and startling because it was supposed to get your attention in an emergency. After the 20th false alert, your brain would start ignoring it entirely. Warning fatigue. Then when an actual pedestrian appeared, the alert meant nothing because you had been conditioned to dismiss it. Drivers would either turn the volume down to inaudible, defeating the purpose, or disable the system entirely. GM discontinued it after 2 model years. Mercedes kept it for 1 more generation, then quietly removed it from the options list. A safety feature that made you less safe because it trained you to ignore warnings. Premium technology that worked against human psychology. Adaptive air suspension with multiple ride modes that all felt the same. Range Rover, Mercedes, Audi, Porsche. These systems let you select Comfort, Sport, or Sport Plus modes that would adjust damping and ride height. Cost between $4,000 and $8,000 depending on the vehicle. Here is what actually happened. The difference between modes was so subtle that in blind tests, drivers could not identify which mode the car was in. The damping adjustments were real, measurable on equipment, but the human body could not perceive them during normal driving. You would switch from Comfort to Sport and feel nothing. Maybe on a perfectly smooth test track under controlled conditions, an expert driver could detect a slight difference in body roll during aggressive cornering. But in real-world driving on real roads, the modes were indistinguishable. Magazines would review these systems and describe enormous differences between modes because they knew the differences were supposed to be there. Owners would convince themselves they could feel it because they had just paid $6,000 for it. But independent testing consistently showed that subjective preference between modes was essentially random. The air suspension itself was fine. The adjustability was marketing. You paid a massive premium for multiple modes when the default mode was already optimized and the other modes did nothing perceptible. The most expensive placebo in automotive history. Active steering that added artificial weight and feedback that felt completely wrong. BMW, Infiniti, and Lexus all experimented with steering systems that used electric motors to adjust steering ratio and effort based on speed. At low speeds, the ratio would quicken for easier parking. At high speeds, it would slow down for stability. Cost between $1,500 and $3,000. Sounds brilliant until you drove one. The steering feel was constantly changing in ways your muscle memory could not adapt to. You would make a small input at 70 miles per hour and the car would move more than expected because the system was in high-speed mode with a slower ratio. Then you would slow down for an exit, and the same steering input would produce a different result because the ratio had changed. Your brain never developed consistent calibration. Worse, the motors added artificial resistance to simulate road feel, but it felt nothing like actual mechanical feedback. It was numb and vague, often described as video game steering. Enthusiast magazines destroyed these systems in reviews. BMW discontinued their active steering after 2 generations. Infiniti dropped it entirely. Lexus kept trying for a few more years before giving up. The fundamental problem was unsolvable. Human beings develop muscle memory for steering response. A system that constantly changes that response prevents muscle memory from forming. You paid $3,000 for steering that made you a worse driver because you could never predict what it would do. Variable ratio steering still exists in some forms, but those early active systems were universally hated by anyone who actually understood vehicle dynamics. Every one of these features was written in ink on an options sheet and penciled into a salesperson's pitch. Years of development budgets and marketing promises. Buyers who genuinely believed they were getting cutting-edge technology that would improve their driving experience. They were not. They were getting first-generation implementations of ideas that sounded perfect in a boardroom and failed immediately when exposed to real-world conditions, human behavior, and actual physics. Next time you're configuring a new car, and you see some expensive technology option that promises to revolutionize something, remember that the previous generation of revolutionary technology is currently making a grinding noise in someone's driveway while they search for the manual override procedure. The gap between what luxury features promise and what they actually deliver has always been the most expensive space in the automotive world. Drop a comment telling me which of these you actually paid for and whether you are still bitter about it. Next time, I am covering luxury car features that were discontinued in the last 5 years that nobody noticed were gone until they tried to find them on the new model. Some of them you assumed were standard forever. They are not.